The worst winter storm to hit Gaza's displacement camps since the war began has submerged the shelters that 1.9 million displaced people are living in, and there is nowhere else for them to go. On Tuesday, February 24th, heavy rain and falling temperatures hit Al-Mawasi, the strip of coastal land west of Khan Yunis, where the Israeli military directed hundreds of thousands of displaced Palestinians to shelter in tents on open sand. The tents flooded. So Gaza's civil defense received multiple distress calls overnight. Rescue teams were deployed to pull families from submerged shelters. Additional flooding hit West Gaza City, Al-Rimal, near the port. No verified rainfall total has been published. No official evacuation count released. No agency has confirmed how many families lost their shelter overnight. What has been confirmed is this: several families had to be physically rescued from tents that were underwater. The shelter they were given as a substitute for the homes they lost is now the thing they needed rescuing from. But here is the detail that tells the real story. Al-Mawasi is not a refugee camp. It was never built to be one. It is a strip of low-lying agricultural coastal land west of Khan Yunis, sandy soil, no drainage infrastructure, no sewage system, no paved roads. Before the war, this was farmland, crops, open ground, nothing else. When the Israeli military designated it as part of the humanitarian zone and directed displaced civilians southward, hundreds of thousands of people arrived carrying what they had left. They pitched tents on sand, in rows, on flat ground that sits barely above the water table. Tarp walls, pole frames, fabric floors lay directly on earth that has never been graded, channeled, or prepared for human habitation at any scale. There is no elevation. There is no drainage. There is no hardened surface beneath a single tent. When rain falls on Al-Mawasi, it does not run off. It pools. It sits. It rises from below as the sand saturates and the water table pushes upward to meet the surface. The water does not rush through camp like a flood. It seeps slowly until everything at ground level is underwater. On Tuesday night, the rain came, and the tents went under. The ground that was never prepared for people could not protect the people placed on it. To understand how Gaza arrived here, watch the timeline accelerate. By late Monday, February 23rd, a low-pressure system carrying heavy rain and dropping temperatures was moving across the eastern Mediterranean toward the Gaza coast. Meteorologist Laith Al-Alami posted that sustained rainfall and cold conditions would hit through Tuesday, easing by Tuesday evening. By overnight Monday into Tuesday, a rain was falling on displacement camps already sitting on ground, saturated from weeks of intermittent winter weather. In Al-Mawasi, water began entering tents from ground level, pooling around bases, soaking through fabric floors, rising inside shelters where families were sleeping. By Tuesday morning, February 24th, Gaza's civil defense was receiving multiple distress calls from flooded camps across Al-Mawasi. Rescue teams dispatched to extract families from tents fully or partially submerged. Video showed displaced people wading through ankle to knee-deep floodwater between rows of collapsed and waterlogged shelters. Children carried above the waterline, belongings floating. The tarp and pole structures that constituted home for hundreds of thousands of people were buckling under the weight of pooled water on fabric that was never meant to hold it. Flooding confirmed in West Gaza City, the Al-Rimal neighborhood and areas near the port, expanding the scale beyond a single camp. On Wednesday, February 25th, the EU's Emergency Response Coordination Center issued a daily flash update documenting the Al-Mawasi rescues and confirming several families pulled from submerged tents. No official count of affected families published. No verified casualty figure released. No agency confirmed where the rescued families were relocated, because in Gaza there is no secondary shelter system. There is no backup. There is the tent. And when the tent floods, there is nothing. And then it got worse. Not because the rain intensified, because of where the rain was falling. Al-Mawasi sits on Gaza's coastal plain. The soil is predominantly sand, porous enough to absorb a light shower, but with almost no capacity to manage sustained or heavy rainfall. There is no stormwater drainage, no culverts, no graded surfaces to direct runoff away from inhabited areas. Before the war, this land did not need any of that. It was agricultural. Crops grow in sand. People do not live in it. When hundreds of thousands of displaced civilians were directed to this strip and pitched tents directly on the ground, they created an unplanned settlement on a floodplain with zero water management. Every tent sits at ground level. Every pathway between tents is unpaved sand. When rain saturates the top layer, the water table rises to meet the surface from below. The result is not a flash flood. It is a slow, rising inundation. Water does not rush through the camp. It seeps upward. It pools. And because the terrain is flat and low-lying with no gradient to carry runoff toward the coast, it does not drain. It sits in the tents, around the tents, under the tents, until it evaporates or is manually pumped out. And there are no pumps? Here's the problem that is not making headlines. This is not a weather event. This is the inevitable result of sheltering a displaced population on unsuitable terrain with no infrastructure. Every civil engineer knows that tents on low-lying coastal sand in a Mediterranean winter will flood. It is not a question of weather. It is physics, rain falls, sand saturates, water rises, tents go under, families need rescuing from the shelter they were told was safe. The designation of Al-Mawasi as a humanitarian zone was a military decision. The absence of drainage, hardened surfaces, raised platforms, or any flood mitigation inside that zone is a humanitarian planning failure that has been visible since the first tent was pitched. Expert, quote, needed, humanitarian shelter specialist, or UNRWA, engineer on flood vulnerability of tent camps on coastal sand. The families pulled from submerged tents on Tuesday night did not end up in a flood zone by accident. They were directed there, they were told to go there, and the infrastructure needed to keep them dry when winter arrived was never built. Not because it could not be, because it was not. The rain started after dark. That is the detail that makes this worse than it already sounds. Families were sleeping. Children were on the ground inside tents when the water began rising through the fabric floor. Not pouring in from the sides, rising from below, through the sand, through the base of the shelter. There was no warning siren. There is no alert system in Al-Mawasi, no speakers, no SMS network, no community notification protocol for weather events in a displacement camp that was never designed to be a displacement camp. The first warning was the water itself, cold, rising, touching skin in the dark. One resident described waking to find water already covering the floor of the tent, soaking through the blankets her children were sleeping on. She carried them out in the dark, barefoot, into floodwater between the rows of shelters with no idea where to go because every tent around her was flooding too. Another family, already displaced 3 times since October 2023, lost the last of what they had carried south. Medications, documents, the blankets they had been given by an aid distribution weeks earlier, all soaked, all ruined. A third account described an elderly man who could not stand on his own being, lifted out of a collapsed tent by neighbors who were themselves knee-deep in water and trying to save their own shelters at the same time. Gaza's civil defense responded to multiple simultaneous distress calls across Al-Mawasi. In a functioning city, that response involves fire departments, ambulance services, municipal emergency management with dedicated vehicles and staging areas. In Gaza, in February 2026, civil defense operates with depleted equipment, limited fuel, damaged vehicles, and personnel who have been running continuous emergency shifts since October 2023. The same teams that pull survivors from collapsed buildings after airstrikes are now pulling families from flooded tents after rain. The threat changes. The exhaustion does not. The capacity does not. Video from Tuesday shows the aftermath. Rows of collapsed tents, standing water between shelter lines stretching in every direction. Personal belongings soaked and scattered, clothing, blankets, food supplies, identification documents, medications. People standing in flood water, holding children above the waterline. A man carrying a toddler through knee-deep water between tents that are no longer standing. A woman pulling a soaked mattress out of a shelter that has no floor left to put it on. The displacement that began with bombs has now been compounded by rain. Families who lost their homes in airstrikes, who walked south along corridors they were told to follow, who built makeshift shelter in a zone they were told was safe, stood in water inside that shelter on Tuesday night, waiting for a rescue team that was already stretched past its limit. They had already lost everything once. The rain made them lose it again. As of Wednesday, February 25th, the EU's Emergency Response Coordination Center has documented the Al-Mawasi flooding and confirmed rescues of several families from submerged tents. Gaza's civil defense has confirmed multiple distress calls and emergency responses overnight. No official casualty figure released. No count of affected families published. No assessment of how many shelters were destroyed or rendered uninhabitable has been made public. The weather system has passed. The forecast has improved. Except nothing about this has been resolved. The tents are still on the same sand. The sand still has no drainage. The winter is not over. The next system will arrive on the same terrain, hit the same shelters, flood the same families who are still drying out from this one. There is no secondary shelter system, no elevated platforms, no hardened ground beneath the tents, no pumps, no weather alert network. Nothing has changed between this flood and the next one except that the blankets soaked on Tuesday night will not be dry by the time the next rain falls. How do you tell families who were displaced by airstrikes and directed to Al-Mawasi as a safe zone that the zone floods every time it rains, and no one built drainage? How do you explain to parents who carried their children south through a war zone, who walked for hours along roads they were told to take, that the tent they were given as shelter had to be evacuated because it filled with water while their children slept? And if a single winter rainstorm can submerge the tents that 1.9 million displaced people are living in, and there is no backup shelter, no drainage, no alert system, and no plan, what happens when the next storm arrives? In Al-Mawasi, the tents are still pitched where they were placed, on sand, on a coastal flood plain, with nothing beneath them. The rain stopped. The water did not leave, and the next system is already forming over the Mediterranean.